I recently bought this box of drywall anchors at Colonial Hardware up on Collie Avenue. Nothing fancy about these. They're just they're screws and plastic anchors guys like me use to hang stuff that's way too heavy for where I plan to hang it. The box says it's packaged in the U.S. from parts from China, China, Canada, Germany, India, Taiwan, Thailand, and the U.S. There's like 5 companies went into making them, countries. So where were these things actually made? If I felt I needed to apply trade sanctions over unfair trade practices in drywall anchors, which country do I target? Even a loaf of bread, something made with an American label, in this case, Sara Wheat whole wheat white bread, has ingredients from 14 countries in it. And these are pretty simple products. Imagine what it's like for a more complicated product, like, for example, an iPhone. A device which, without anyone under 21, is functionally mute and unable to communicate. An iPhone is made in China, depicted on your left. But if you accept that made in label as telling the truth, you get a very inaccurate picture of where that device is really made. In truth, China provides only a very small amount of the total value of an iPhone, maybe 3 to 4%, and that's depicted on your right. Actually, Germany, South Korea, and Japan provide the bulk of the value of an iPhone. The rest of the world category, by the way, includes the U.S., which provides things like computer chips without which an iPhone does not work. So if we want to sanction iPhones, who is really hurt? The Chinese? Not really. If we want to, quote-unquote, bring these jobs home and make iPhones in the U.S., who do we target? Do we target China? Is that really where the high-skill, high-wage work associated with making an iPhone is done? Economists call this trade in tasks, a production process that is so disaggregated and dispersed that the distinction between goods and services actually gets blurry. And this is really the hallmark of the post-industrial phase of this age of globalization. Well over half of all containerized trade is now in component-level goods, stuff headed for further processing in some factory assembly line, including imports into the United States. So much as the air cargo example, shutting down ports in response to a perceived threat will rapidly be seen in unemployment in places far from ports as factories get starved of components to continue production. That is a major issue when thinking about or making policy about trade these days. The made-in label is meaningless and potentially dangerous, and it can give policymakers a false sense of where they can afford to take risk, so that they can reasonably appreciate where they're going to see unintended consequences for their actions, because they simply cannot. By the way, we may get a chance to see some of these sort of cascading effects in action here in a couple of weeks if the ILA does not come to agreement with employers and there is a long short strike on the East Coast and Gulf Coast, particularly as Christmas stuff starts to throw through the logistics pipeline. Speaking of China, by the way, people are always harping on China for the trade position versus the United States. First, as the previous discussion points out, traditional trade measures do not accurately capture who we're really trading with, so do not really present an accurate picture of what is happening in any specific trade relationship. Another point that often gets missed outside of our NAFTA partners is that outside of our NAFTA partners, China is not just the largest place we buy stuff from, it is the largest place we sell stuff to. China is by far our largest customer, both in total exports and also in containerized exports across a wide variety of goods. There's an excellent book called Travels of a T-Shirt by Pietro Rivoli that is worth the read for a non-technical discussion of these sorts of nuances in global trade. The book is much more illuminating in a world that's flat, where Friedman largely talks about who he had dinner with. As the title suggests, Rivoli, a Georgetown economist, bought a T-shirt, then traced its manufacturer supply chain back to its origins. The made-in label says it came from China, but in fact it started out as cotton in Texas. Our trade relationship is far more complex than cheap sneakers for Walmart shelves, and that view of that relationship is, in my opinion, dangerous, since it again presents a view of where we can take risk that is not at all accurate. I personally do not believe a conflict with China is winnable from a political perspective. We are at the same place with them as we were with the Russians when it dawned on all concerned that a nuclear war was not winnable by anyone. The devastation wrought on economies around the world and associated social disruption as a result of a conflict between the U.S. and China would produce knock-on effects that would rival the first two world wars in consequence. We should remember that during the first great age of globalization, when the global economy was highly integrated and interdependent, The prevailing wisdom of the day was that the world was too integrated to ever engage in major war. World War I, which ended that age of globalization, proved them wrong. In a U.S.-China conflict, someone, presumably us, might declare military victory, but they'd be doing it standing atop of smoldering ruins of a devastated global economy, this time including our own, unlike World War II. An excellent book, Planning Armageddon, by Nicholas Lambert, is a worthwhile read, and it's an effort. It's about 500 pages for anyone contemplating war with China. It goes through British economic warfare with Germany prior to World War I, but there are lots of lessons learned that apply here today. The U.S.-China relationship is the single most important country-pair trade relationship in the world, and the U.S. and China are right at the top in total world trade. While few people doubt the U.S. is the world's largest importer, most don't realize where the U.S. in terms of its position as a dominant exporter. And as I mentioned, China is our biggest customer, and on an absolute basis, China actually imports more than we do. I do not believe, by the way, that, at least from an economic perspective, a rising China is something we need to worry about. For a variety of reasons, China is probably close to peaking. Some estimates are the cost advantage of manufacturing in China, as opposed to the U.S., will be gone by 2015, for example. And Chinese manufacturing prowess certainly looks a little less intimidating when viewed from the proper context. Manufacturing value add per capita, where China ranks 12th. It takes China 100 million people to do what the U.S. does with 11 million. It is a declining China that I think we really need to worry about, a much more dangerous situation. Events in the Middle East, and particularly Iran, tend to focus our attention on that part of the planet as the global gas station. But the world of petropolitics is also on the verge of large discontinuous change that will have implications for the Navy. Some we're familiar with, such as the vast natural gas holdings unlocked in the U.S. by fracking, making the U.S. a major natural gas supplier. Among other things, this means energy for U.S. manufacturers is cheap and getting cheaper, part of the debate about whether or not to allow export of U.S. LNG, giving an edge to U.S. manufacturers as they compete globally for customers. It also destroyed the $15 billion to-date investment that is the Stockman gas project in the Russian Arctic, in which the U.S. had been firmly in its sights as a large customer. It's not particularly good news for the Port of Virginia in some ways, as coal exports will also be affected. There are also always winners and losers in economic change, and the losers never accept their position gracefully. The rapid rise in U.S. oil production, with developments such as the Bakken oil field in the upper Midwest, has likewise dramatically altered the picture of energy supply in the U.S., with estimates now being the U.S. could be independent of imports of oil from anywhere other than our current largest source of imported oil, Canada, within a couple of years. The U.S. is also an exporter of refined oil now. We are a net exporter of refined oil. It is informative, by the way, to see how rapidly that outlook has changed. It reminds us of the dangers of linear projections when contemplating what the world will look like or what you will need to be prepared to respond to. In this case, you can see how rapidly the Energy Information Agency shifts downward their estimates of our dependence on foreign oil. While they are still not as optimistic as the private forecasters, their conservatism is getting corrected at a very high rate. On a related note, if you look at EIA data, you can see that U.S. crude stockpiles now exceed the highest end of the 5-year average for this time of year. And this slide is as of the last update, which was last week. I'm not really sure what an SPR would do, since we're not short of crude, but that's a topic in its own right. In my mind, it's what's happening in Israel that is a real game changer as far as energy goes. The Leviathan gas field off the coast of Israel is estimated to hold 122 trillion cubic feet, or roughly half of U.S. reserves of natural gas, and 4 billion barrels of oil. Things like a pipeline to move Israeli gas into Europe are already being discussed, which will impact, again, Russia's customer base. A country that is broke, arrogant, hungry, and armed with large number of nuclear weapons is not the ideal neighbor, and that could be Russia in a few years as new energy discoveries adversely impact the value of what they have to offer the world. Russia needs oil prices above $100 a barrel to balance its budget, and Citigroup estimates Russia needs oil prices in the $150 a barrel range for the government to make good on its promises to its population. The Leviathan also gives Israel and Lebanon something to fight about if they needed anything else. So Israel also has the Shafala oil field, which is just now being developed. That field, located south of Jerusalem, is estimated to hold about 250 billion barrels of oil, putting it on par with Saudi Arabia. 10 or 15 years from now, one of the world's major petro powers may well be Israel, and the Straits of Gibraltar will have taken on the aura of indispensability as an energy thoroughfare that the Straits of Hormuz have now. The rapidity with which things change also has implications for the Arctic, and I'm not speaking about melting ice. A focus on the Arctic seems to be popular these days, but I think a round turn on reality is in order there as well. Everyone notes the large amount of oil and gas up there, but as the Russians found out with Stockman, just because it's there doesn't necessarily mean it makes economic sense to pull it out of the ground. And the Russians are not alone there, by the way. According to the Energy Information Agency, the U.S. could also be out of the Arctic energy business if its low oil price scenario, meaning prices in the $60, $70 barrel range, prove true. In that case, we'll be capping wells and decommissioning the Trans-Alaska pipeline system within 15 years. I think the EIA estimates, by the way, for out years don't do a very good job of estimating the effects of substitution, with natural gas being cheaper and cleaner than oil. There is already a large movement to move to natural gas for things like electricity production and transport fuel, a project we ourselves are deeply involved in, which will have an outsized impact on the oil demand and hence price, and therefore EIA may actually be a little too cautious about the price of oil. It could well be much lower. A common assumption in our industry, for example, is that new construction ships within the next few years will all use LNG as bunkers. As far as shipping goes in the Arctic, just because the route between 2 points is shorter on a map does not mean that it's faster, and certainly not cheaper. And in the Arctic, that's particularly true. The Northwest Passage will never be useful as a large-scale transit route. Among other things, it's too shallow unless you can get through the Lancaster Strait, which is the Northwest access route, and NOAA isn't expecting that anytime soon. This highlights a major weakness in Arctic projects. They overlay a melting Arctic on the geoeconomic situation as we find it today. But in the time span we're talking about for some of the ice scenarios to play out, the container completely revolutionized world trade that led to a reordering of economic power in China, where it is today. A lot can happen in 30 years, so what matters is not a melted Arctic overlaid on the trade and energy situation we find today, but what that situation will look like in the future. On the other hand, the Northern Sea route across the top of Russia is a much more useful route now, and likely to grow in utility as a route to move Arctic origin commodities to Asia, what we call destination shipping. Hence China's large interest in the Arctic. It certainly helps their Malacca problem, for example, as Arctic originating in the Barents and moved across the top of Russia is a lot harder for you to interdict than the traditional route out of the Middle East. The Northern Sea route's utility as a transit route for general trade, though, is a little more debatable. Aside from technical issues such as draft and economy of scale, changing trade patterns also impact the value of the Arctic. Chinese labor has become comparatively expensive, and China is outsourcing labor-intensive, low-skill work out of China to Southeast Asian countries where the Arctic does not actually present any distance advantage at all. There are many similar areas where looming changes have implications for the Navy. But in the interest of time, we'll skip now to the ultimate game changer, looking into the big crystal ball. What is it that will make what I do, what my industry does, largely obsolete? That technology is here, I believe, and will be technology that recent graduates who just put on their ensign bars will have to deal with when they are flag officers. Only by then the briefing will start out by noting that 10% of world trade moves by water, and the low value versus high value stuff, that distinction won't matter, since everything will be low value. That technology is the 3D printer. 3D printers, coupled with advances in material sciences and nanotechnology, make local on-demand manufacturing a reality, which means making stuff in some faraway place and putting it in a container no longer necessary. Trade will be done by sending computer files with printing instructions for local production. A company is already in business that prints crescent wrenches that are stronger than their traditionally manufactured steel competitors. Considering that it is possible to print a fully functional rifle, soon smuggling the weapons will be done by cyber smugglers embedding printing code in pictures rather than hiding physical weapons and legitimate cargo.